My name is Alisha Saucedo. I am the 2018 Regional Teacher of the Year, PSESD. Here with all of these lovely students that I am going to allow them to introduce themselves in just a second, but I'm also here with David, who's going to introduce himself. Go ahead, David.
Hi, I'm David Meidenbeld. I'm the 2021 Regional Teacher of the Year from ESD 113. I'm here co-hosting with Ms. Saucedo.
And so we are going to ask those of you that are here, participants, to go ahead and use the Q&A to help us stay organized with your questions. Panelists would prefer that. So we're going to stick with what the panelists would prefer. So in just a second, I'm going to go ahead and ask them to introduce themselves. As a reminder, students, it is okay to give us a long list of your accomplishments and let the audience listening know just how amazing you are. So let's go ahead and, we can start with our freshmen on the panel, and then we can move up to our seniors. Kaiser.
Good morning. I'm a freshman. I attend Kentwood High School in Kent School District. I take AP and honors classes. I like AP World History. That's probably my favorite class. Pretty writing intensive, which is a lot of fun. I run track and field for the Junior Olympic circuit, and I'm on varsity track and field and cross country.
Laila.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Laila Markland. I'm a junior at River Ridge High School. I'm a member of the North Thurston Public Schools BSU, and I am a member of the Ethnic Studies Committee. And yeah.
It's okay. Priyaka.
Hi everyone, my name is Priyaka. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I go to Interlake High School in Bellevue, Washington, and I'm a junior. And some things about me: I'm on WASN, Washington Ethnic Studies Now, as a Youth Advisory Board member. I'm also on Washington Legislative Youth Advisory Council as a first-year member. And through that council, I've helped write and co-sponsor a piece of legislation, House Bill 1373, which you should check out if you have the time. And I'm also a very avid debater on the state level, and I'm so looking forward to talking to you guys all today.
And our two seniors, Caleb or Alisha, either one of you want to go first?
I can go. So my name is Caleb Morris. I'm a senior at Timberline High School. I'm also the ASB Vice President, and I'm also a member of the North Thurston Public Schools Black Student.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alisha Saucedo. You guys can call me Allie, and I'm a senior at Thomas Jefferson High School. I'm a part of our Students Organized Against Racism club. It's also part of like a district organization. I've also helped out with a lot of events through our school's BSU. I run track, cross country, and I play basketball. I'm the captain for those teams. And I'm also involved in leadership at my school. So those are just a couple of things about me. And I'm also really excited to be talking with you guys today.
So before we get started, which is to focus on these students and their voices, we do have a Padlet in which we'd like to ask our participants not our panelists, but our participants watching, to go ahead and take a second. What is education for? And that is something that we asked our students previous to this conference, is to tell us what they believed education is for. And so we are going to ask them to take a second to revisit that question and think about maybe what they would like to reiterate or come back to before we actually get into other pieces of our time with them today. And so panelists, can you just remind us, what is education for?
Yeah, I can start out. So I think that education generally is just to prepare people for life beyond high school. But again, that can mean many, many different things. And I think we'll get into the intricacies of that later today. So I'll just say that education is to prepare people for post-high school life.
Yeah, and to just sort of jump off of that, I think education is to make students and to make our youth the best versions of themselves, so that way they can move on and meet their goals and be who they want to be. And it's supposed to give people tools for the future, just like Priyanka said, but I think it's focused on people more than just like curriculum or a book or a fact. And that's sort of what I emphasize in the podcast and what I want to emphasize again here today. It's about growing yourself as a person.
I would say education is any free form of learning. I think there's a difference between education and schooling, because schooling is like a certain curriculum, but education is, I think education can be anything outside of school, obviously. But just learning on your own terms and learning as much as you want, or anything you want.
Education for me is about empowerment. It's making sure that everybody feels like they can go through life and feel powerful and like they know who they are. It's making sure that everybody is the student and we're all human first in the classroom.
I think education on a large part is the successful combination of curriculum and Socratic learning, and putting that together to give what the individual wants to do post high school or post college, whether that be trade school or college. You want to ensure that they're aware of the necessary curriculum and things like that to move forward, but you also want to ensure that they have a deep understanding of life's social contracts and the many things of that aren't focused on in that tight curriculum. And so it really should be tailored towards what each individual wants to do. And of course, that gets into a larger question of how feasible that is on a public institution and on such a wide scale. But it really should be focused on what the individual needs to get through and where they want their goals to be in the next 10 to 20 years.
So thinking about what education is for and how you reimagine education based on your definition of what education is for, we did have an opportunity to talk for just 10 minutes-ish, where you were able to kind of scratch the surface of how you reimagine education. Listening to the other panelists and thinking about your podcast, how do you reimagine education? What can we? Let's dig into maybe what you did not have the opportunity to tell us in the podcast. Let's dig more into the idea of what is education for and how do you reimagine it?
I can start. So I want to go back to a word that Laila said, which is empowerment. And I think that that's such a powerful word and a powerful tool that I think teachers and just educators can use. That's how I reimagine education, is every student feels like good about themselves and feels like they have the tools that they need. And I think that starts by building relationships with your students, because you need that trust and you need that relationship simply for them to be able to learn from you and take what you have. And they also can give you things too. It's a two-way street. And so I think by making students feel like they're safe and like they're at home and like you believe in them and that you care about them, that just increases the scope of what you can accomplish just immensely. And so I think that's just, Laila said it perfectly in one word. I think it's just empowering your students and building relationships with them.
I think, oh, here, Caleb, you can go.
I was just gonna go off that, and I think that was a good thing, because when I talked about in the podcast interactions with students, and I think interactions between teacher and students is so important, because that's really how you build a relationship. And I personally have found that when I built those personal relationships with teachers, that's when I learn the most, because I think a teacher really makes the class.
One, I have similar views to the other panelists on that the teacher does make the class, but I do believe that a lot of remodeling education needs to come from the top down, because there's only so much individual classes can do before something like a greater thing like a district or a statewide controlled entity can do. And so you kind of get lost in this wave. Like there's many individually good teachers that are held by a very broken system. And so I think reforming education needs to come more of, not even from the top, but just that middle segment from the top giving down to the teachers. And so in that middle segment, we have that crucial part where there's this bureaucracy that's not working. And so that comes into teachers playing their part of building the students. And most teachers have that connection with their students, and most teachers do make their students feel empowered. But there's the teachers who are then have their hands tied by things beyond their control that aren't necessarily coming from the top. That's coming from people in the middle of that bureaucracy that's making that hard to help build those students up. And so I do think a lot of education is already there. Again, like I said in the podcast, I don't think we need to completely tear down the education system and rebuild it. I think there's just some crucial parts that need to be cleaned up or remodeled in a certain way to allow more free range for the teachers.
I like what Kaiser said about the district, and I definitely agree with other panelists that relationships with teachers is very important. But I also think that students need to be the ones to have more say in their education, because kind of like I think Ali was saying earlier, students, we need to make sure that students feel like, education is for them, and giving them the opportunity to tell us, this is what I'm interested in, or this is how I feel about this. This is, I don't feel comfortable learning about this, I think is important, just kind of going into like humanizing education.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that my fellow panelists have said, but I just want to broaden it back out to education as a whole and what makes it so hard to answer the question, what is education for? Just bringing it really home, bringing the point home. I think that Kaiser mentioned this and Caleb also mentioned this. Kaiser mentioned trade school, and that really got me thinking that as not only in our state, but as a collective American society, I think that our education system really tends to emphasize that traditional high school, then four-year college path, then into a job, then into a family with a white picket fence and a wife and a husband and two kids, one girl, one boy. So we really have that very institutionalized idea of what a high schooler should do as soon as they get out of high school, and up until their very last day, we have a plan for what an ideal American family and person really looks like. And I think it's really hard to answer this question, what is education for? Because not everybody wants to travel that path. And we have made it so that our system really does support people going along that path, but maybe not people who want to go to trade school or who want to go traveling instead of going to college or something like that. So I think it's really important that we have a way to emphasize all different paths of life rather than our traditional sense of what we think a high schooler should do after high school. But we definitely need to work towards that more. And I don't think that's going to happen in a year or two. It'll definitely be a whole cultural shift which we should see in the next decade or two.
Yeah, I think those are amazing points, and really focusing on students as individuals and not as this big picture of what you want a perfect society to look like, because perfect is different for everyone and there really is no perfect. And I think a common theme of what Priyaka was saying and also Kaiser is just these big institutionalized problems that need to be fixed. But I also want to sort of redirect that by saying there's always something you can do. There's no, relationships are not written down in a book. There's nothing you can read that can suddenly make your students trust you or can suddenly flip a switch and change things. Some of that has to come internally and has to come from looking in the mirror and saying, hey, what can I do? What are my biases? What are my thoughts? And I think that shift in people as individuals can make much bigger of a change than a writing on a piece of paper or something you read out of a book, because ultimately it has to come it has to come from there. It has to come from those relationships and those people making change. And so I just wanted to also add that, because sometimes challenges can seem so daunting because you're like, oh, well, I can't fix this. There's no way, there's so much to be done. But it starts with you, and it starts with just reaching out to one person, one student, about not their homework, about like not something test related, just about how they are as a human being. And that goes a long way.
So as you're thinking about this, what are some of the myths? I know Priyanka mentioned like the idea that this perfect, life, that this perfect system, this perfect after high school vision. What are some of these myths that essentially make what you are facing more complex, more difficult? Like, how is it? Well, I'm going to stop because I don't want to say too much. But essentially, what are some of those even cultural myths that make this whole process daunting for you as students?
There's no actual like supports for, like there's supports and this idea that, oh, there's going to be people here to support you, but unfortunately, we live in a world where if you're not born with that privilege and that supportive family or supportive network, or however you're getting through to get to where you want to go, it's very difficult to get there. It's not like I don't know how many of you are in Kent, but actually I think I'm the only one. But in Kent School District, they have this thing called the High School and Beyond Plan, and I know they have that at other high schools throughout the state. But from what I've done actually some digging on this, and from what I've asked a lot of these seniors, it's not very helpful. It's like essentially like a little list that it's like, this is how I want to get here, and it doesn't really tell you how to get there. And they're like, oh, but there's all these supports, but it's like there's this myth that everyone's out to support you, and the reality is that's not the case. And if you don't have that, it's very difficult to get it. And these universities and trade schools, they don't care at all. And so like it's a sad truth, and it's not even like they're not doing it maliciously. It's not like, oh, we don't care about anyone, we just want profit. There's millions and millions of children in the United States, and so when they're leaving high school and going into colleges or trade schools or jobs, they don't have to be super welcoming. It's not like they don't have an intake of people, and so there is no actual like supports that they make you believe there are in high school. And it sets a lot of kids up for failure, because they're like, oh, you don't need to, like, since I've come to high school and since last year in middle school, I've been told this time, oh, you don't need to have a plan. You don't need to have a plan. It's like, you have all this time to figure it out. And like, that's not true. There is not all this time to figure it out. You have 4 years, which is incredibly short. And so like, especially in Washington, where you can get like your AA graduating high school, which is an awesome, cool thing. That's why I moved here from Texas. You can get your AA, which is an awesome thing. But if you don't know what you want to do, that's not much use. And so like, you need, there's this myth around this idea, like there's all these supports and you have all this time, but there's not all these supports and you don't have all this time. And so you have to, like, I think the education system needs to acknowledge that and not set kids up for failure in that way.
Yeah, I think another really big myth, not only a myth that like our high school perpetuates, our high school experience perpetuates, but just American society as a whole, it really drives this idea that hard work is all it takes. Like, I'm sure you guys have heard this before, like, no matter your circumstance, people are like, just work hard and you'll get through it, right? We learned that in school through curriculum and through school culture. We'll see people who are failing classes, students that are failing classes that it's not of their own hand. They're in some circumstances at home, or they have any extenuating circumstances that are making them fail their classes. And we just see teachers say, like, well, not all teachers, but mostly we see that culture where if you work harder, you'll bring your grade up. We have our peers tell us that, we have some of our teachers tell us that, and we tell ourselves that a lot of the time. And not only do we see that in our school culture, but we also see that in the curriculum that we're taught. Like, if we even go back to US history and we think about the Jamestown settlers and like how they went through that huge starving time and the plague and everything, the message that we still do come out with at the end in our education system is that they persisted, they created this great country. There was genocide, but I mean, they came out of the other end really, really strong. And you know what? We founded this amazing country out of it. So like that myth of hard work is all it takes really does minimize the experiences of students that are not socioeconomically privileged. And it also just creates this whole sort of animosity within students themselves, because they're like, you know, why can't I do this? Like, it's all it takes is hard work. That's what I've seen in school. That's what people have told me. That's what my curriculum has shown me through history. So why can't I do it? And I think that creates a really negative perception of hard work. And it really does make students kind of hate themselves sometimes.
I think that ties into grades. I mean, a lot of times I feel like we base our entire self-worth off of an A or a D or something. And, you know, we're told that, like, even though teachers are like, it's not about grades, they definitely perpetuate that it is about grades. I think that it needs to be more about, are you understanding this? And I think that they use grades as a gauge to how well people are understanding it, but I don't think that's very accurate. I know a lot of people that are failing, but that's just because they don't feel like they're learning in a way that benefits them, or learning in a way that gets information to them. So I think that making sure, and kind of standardized testing too. I think that we give a lot of, we put a lot of pressure on students to prepare for standardized testing, but I mean, those standardized testing are discriminatory in their creation and in the way that we still use them. So I think that just making sure that we're not putting so much pressure on students to be perfect in the sense that they have great grades or that they get a great grade on their SAT. You know, it's like, are you genuinely understanding this?
I think we lost her, but we'll go ahead and have someone else pick up, and then as soon as we get her back. Oh, there we are. Laila, we lost you for a second. Can you repeat what you said at the very, very tail end? Sorry.
Okay, my internet's a little funky today. I was just saying that making sure that we're not putting so much pressure on students to you know, focus so much on grades or SAT scores, because those are not, you know, they're not, they don't illustrate your self-worth. They're not, you know, that's not what they're for. So I think just being careful on how we push those to students.
I think going off of that, I think a big part is when we put so much pressure on grades, since they're not learning as much because they're not worried about learning it. They're worried about passing the class. So they want to do what they can to get their grades. So oftentimes that's looking up the answer, that's asking a friend if they can, you know, use their answers. And I think I'm not sure how it would be done right now, but encouraging learning over memorizing answers, or finding different processes to go around how teachers want us to do it just so we can get the grade for it. And I think that's great what Laila described. And
Yeah, I think you described like a real world learning. And I think that students experience, like when they see that what they're learning can be applied, it just like increases productivity so much, because they see like, oh, this is useful. I'm going to use this. So I would just encourage like sharing the purpose of the lesson, like the lesson, how is this going to be applied? But that was kind of a side note. I wanted to talk about, again, like that whole state testing idea. And I feel it's very discriminatory in the sense that I've always remembered state testing being during Ramadan. And that's just one prime example of schools or the state or whoever not respecting the like cultures of their students. And like I remember students like snacking during the test and just like this like crunching and just all these things that I felt wasn't respectful, but no one cared, because like oh, we need to like take this test and it's important. And it's like, it leads me into what I think my myth is, which is that the myth is that you're not built for the system. The truth is the system isn't built for you. And we need to sort of have that approach and take that mindset, because it's not that this student is trouble or this student has like a broken home or whatever. No, you need to fit what they need, because that's the point of education, is giving, not taking. So I think by taking that approach of like, we need to change to fit you, then we can like encompass what students need. And like, sorry, another side note, I like to take notes because I like forgot what I'm going to say. So I'm like looking down at what I wrote, but standardized, what is it called? Standards-based grading is what I'm trying to say. Standards-based grading. In my experience, that has not been implemented properly, at least in my experiences. And I just think it's like another example of something that's been written down, something that's supposed to happen, but is not implemented because as people, it's simply not, we're not doing it. And so I just wanted to bring that up. And yeah, I think that was everything.
Going off what Ali said about, students not, or the education system not being built for students, I think that it's important to look at how, the system treats people of color. There's zero tolerance, there's SROs on campus, there's not enough teachers of color, administrators of color. So it's not just about what are you being taught, it's also about how you're being taught and, the environment that you're being taught in. If you don't feel safe, then how are you supposed to give 100% of your effort to your education? If you don't feel like the education is being taught to you by somebody who understands you or who is, compassionate towards what you're feeling or what you're going through or can relate to your experiences, it's going to be hard to feel like you're seen in your education, which I also think is important, is making sure our students are seen in their education, because education is for them. It's not necessarily, for teachers, it's for students more than anything. We're teaching these young people all of this information that they're supposed to go out into the world and use or have. And so making sure that it's being taught to them in a way where they feel cared for and respected is very important.
I have a question, more of a topic of discussion for the other panelists. So I'm not sure how many of you, in Texas, our standardized test is called the STAR test, and it's a very big deal. I remember being sat down by a third grade teacher and being like, if you fail this test, I'll get fired. It was like this whole thing. There's a whole big, it's a horrible, and the STAR test is up there with some of the worst standardized tests in the nation. It's awful. But it's an unfortunate part of being, again, a public institution. It's provided by the state. And so part of the reason we have these grades is because the state needs to have a benchmark of how to fund the schools and how to do it. And it's a public institution. And so unfortunately, we have those strings attached to it. It's like, this is this wonderful thing. How do we work with that? And so my question of discussion for the other panelists is, how do we reform that? How do we give the state that mark? Because we still want to have this beautiful and awesome thing provided to us. And so how do we come around things like standardized testing, which I 100% agree are discriminatory and essentially useless? Anyone can pass a standardized test or fail the standardized test based on how you woke up that morning. And so and don't get me started on the equal space grading and GPAs and there's no standardization on that. That's a whole other can of worms. But how do we reform that and standardize that across the board to where we can make that to where it's beneficial to the students and giving that state that benchmark that they need to make our schools operate? They need that benchmark, which is an unfortunate thing, but they need that for the state congresses and the federal congresses and all the committees that run the national school institutions. So what's that reform there?
I think that where we can start is fixing the connotation around testing. You said, I think the most important thing that you said was that your teacher was like, I'm going to get fired if you fail this. No, you're not. Like, that's simply not true. Teachers are also valuing their self-worth and their teaching off of something like not important, as you just said. And so I think by like principals and just like educators, teachers in general, switching like the connotation around these tests until we can reform the system, I think that will go a long way, just by saying, hey, try your best. I've taught you this, you know what you know, and that's okay. And being honest with their students. We know that this test is tough. We know that sitting here for a long time or learning in this way doesn't work for everyone, but that's okay. And it's okay to not be okay and to not know. And I think that changing that is a great place to start.
Yeah, I think also, like, I think everything that Alicia said is like, or Ali, sorry, said is very, very valid. And I also want to add on that I think that a lot of the pressure for standardized testing can actually come from the family. So Kaiser and Alicia talked about like, school pressures and teacher pressures, but I identify as an Asian American, and in the Asian American diaspora, there's a lot of pressure towards standardized testing because the fact is that in India, in China, in Korea, in Japan, everything, your entire high school life culminates in one test, a standardized test, which is for college entrance. And that one test, quite frankly, can determine the course of the rest of your life. And that culture of that test being so important to many of our parents. My parents immigrated from India, so they had to go through that very same test. It becomes like a very cultural thing where parents tend to really emphasize standardized testing for their kids, especially immigrant parents, really emphasize standardized testing because it's the only thing that they really know matters. They haven't gone through the American education system, and so they're just latching on to the thing that they think means a lot. And because of that, I think there's a lot of internalized pressure to perform well on standardized tests for a lot of Asian Americans, specifically Asian Americans that are first generation American, because there's so much of that internalized importance that is set on standardized tests from their parents' childhood, and that really does tend to transfer on to students.
I think the whole idea of standardized testing is skewed as well, because if there's a whole standard, then every school should have equal funding, every school should have equal education, every school should have a standard of all those things. So if each school doesn't have a standard of learning or a standard of teaching, then how can we have a standard of testing?
I agree with that. I do think it's ironic that the state wants us to take a standardized test, and then there's the difference between in Kent we have schools like Northwood, and then we have schools like Meeker, and there's this massive gap in equity, and which is ironic because that's KSD's whole thing is equity, and there's this huge gap of equity, and like now we want you to take the same test, and like it is, if you're going to adjust things like funding and payroll and PTSA funding and things like that, then you need to adjust those tests, or better, like Caleb said, is you need to equalize the funding and you need to equalize the payrolls. You need to make it to where these schools are getting equal resources, which gets tricky, but you have to pick one or the other. You have to adapt the tests to the schools, or you need to adapt the schools to the test. And so either way, something's going to have to be changed to fit one or the other. And I personally think it'd be easier to change the test to the schools, but now that doesn't mean that's what's the right thing to do. I do think every school should have the chance to have equal funding and equal opportunity. But starting with the small things first, I think it would be beneficial to change that test and then start working towards this standard of education. The idea that there could be a standard test on paper is a good one, because that should mean that your education system is standard across the board. So if we can work towards that goal and make it to where every school is getting the same opportunity, then standardized tests become a lot less of a serious issue and a lot less discriminatory, because if everyone has the equal opportunity there, then it should be on paper, like it's called a standardized test, it's standard, but we don't have that. And so I think I agree with Caleb, what he was saying there is just like, it's ironic that you want to take a standard test in a very different school districts. And so like, or schools even within districts.
And I completely agree with what Kaiser and Caleb were saying about the need in the long term to reform school funding or even reform the process of standardized testing as a whole. But I think that in terms of short-term change, it's also very important to emphasize that reformation of culture and the deprioritization of standardized testing on the part of teachers and parents. And in the short term, I think that can make a really big difference in the lives of students who maybe don't really want to prioritize standardized testing, can't prioritize standardized testing. It really will help reduce that gap between socioeconomic status of schools and individual students if schools culturally in a culturally based way decide to really scale back the importance of standardized testing in their teachers and their students, and even in the parents of students at the schools.
For sure. I think that's like a great topic of conversation, a great way to start. And I think I want to shift the conversation a little bit, if that's okay, onto I feel like a common word that a lot of us have been talking about, which is like resources or supports. And I think a common problem, I would say, we all need different things. We've established that we're all individuals, we all have different needs. But just because somebody comes from what your teacher or what school considers like a broken home, or because they're a student of color, or because they get in trouble, doesn't mean they need you to lower the bar for them. And so while we're saying, hey, like we want, for example, standardized testing, like we don't want you to make it easier on us. We just want you to make it applicable, and we want you to make it right for us. But it doesn't mean that you need to lower our standard for us as students. We still want to be challenged and have like rigorous education. And so I kind of wanted to like bring that topic of conversation up about how like how teachers treat their students, and how like activity in the classroom affects productivity, I guess, and just like how much power teachers hold. Priyaka mentioned like it's about teachers and parents that of changing like that their perspectives, but like teachers, sometimes you spend more time with your teachers than you do with your parents because you're at school for how many hours. And so teachers hold so much power in students' lives and they don't even recognize it. So I mean, I guess that's just what I want to say, like talking about that. I don't know if that's like clear, but
And I think that's a good point as well, because I go to school, I see my teachers once every 2 days, almost gonna be 4 days next week. But then I go to after school activities, then I go to work, and then I come home and my mom's already sleeping. Then I wake up and she's already gone because she works. So I don't see her every day. I don't get to see her at every moment. And I think that's good what you touched on, how much influence teachers have over students.
Can I pop in with a QA question for you all? Earlier, you were talking about self-empowerment. So a question that came in was, you all seem empowered in your own right. Would you say that came from teachers or a combination of people and experiences?
I would say that it's teachers and just my parents specifically. My dad, he is very big on my brothers and I learning about Black.
Mm-mm. Mhm. What we can do is we
Sorry.
can, oh, there you are.
Sorry. I was just saying that my dad is very big on my brothers and I learning about Black culture and Black history, not through school because it's very dehumanizing. So my parents and my mom is always like, stand up for yourself. Make sure that you're getting what you need. But I also have a lot of teachers who do the same thing. They make sure that all the students. Are we better? Can you hear me a little bit better? Okay. Sorry. But yeah, I have a avid teacher, BSU advisors, old. I mean, history and English teachers from middle school that have definitely helped me feel empowered in what I'm learning, and have always taught me that my grades are not everything, and just have made me feel like I can do anything I wanted to do. So
I definitely feel as I've been empowered by teachers. Largely in my life, though, it comes from my parents more than my teachers. And I've had teachers who are excellent teachers and have empowered me throughout my life. But largely for me, in my experience, that comes from my family. And so my mom grew up very poor. We always joke about it that we fought our way from the trailer park because she was from a trailer park. And so it's a little rural town out in Texas. And so like we've come a long way to our nice home, and my mom and dad have worked a long time. And so for me, I found a lot of empowerment from my family in those experiences as a young child, getting to kind of watch as my parents' hard work evolved my life more and more into where it's come increasingly with more privilege and support as they've essentially built this foundation for our life. And it was those experiences, kind of watching that come from like an apartment to a little house, and like a house, apartments, townhome, is that what they're called? Yeah, like a townhome, to like getting a new home that we rented, until like getting to our own house. We bought a house in Texas, to then moving here. So like it was cool to like looking back, and at the time I was little, I had no idea what was going on, but looking back I can see it was like my parents working from poverty, extreme poverty, into building us into this big wonderful life. And that has empowered me more than per se most of my teachers have, and teachers have empowered me, but a lot of it for me is just feeling the need to carry on my parents' legacy. Is like, look at all this, like one generation seems like a lot, but I'm not that far from the traumas and the poverty that I was born into. And so a lot of my empowerment comes from trying to build forward what my parents have given me. And so teachers are a big role for that, but I do feel like the people do have a lot of influence from their teachers, but I do think it's one of, like we were talking about, one of those myths. I do feel like even subconsciously people take a lot of their identity and their internal worth and empowerment from how their parents are and how they have built them and that foundation they gave them. And so teachers are an important role of that. But I feel like if a lot of people looked really deep, a lot of what drives them is something from their parents and that home life and community.
Yeah, I would say I've have a similar experience, or I guess a similar privilege, to be empowered by my parents. But I also feel like it's sort of a puzzle, or like building a house, and like without these foundational pieces, like the puzzle wouldn't be together. The house wouldn't be built without those teachers that did empower me, or that did say they believed in me. And so I think that while everyone has different experiences, the value that teachers have is like still, not like standard, but it's still there, even with like a big support at home or not, or like you have that choice to be there. And I feel like parents, there's one thing about like a family, that they're kind of your given supports. They're supposed to care about you. But teachers have like a choice. And I think that you shouldn't have a choice. You should care about all your students, and you should believe in them like they're your family, like they're your kids, because that love that you have for them and that like belief you have in them is just like remarkable, and it can really change like who they are. And so I don't want to like negate the power that teachers hold, even though parents do have influence in our lives, positive or negative. I know students who have like school is their chosen home because they like it there, they like their teachers, or they like what they've given them. And it's way more powerful than just you were given parents or whatever, or grandparents or whoever, but you have a choice to be empowered by your teachers, or your teachers the other way around. And that also brings me into saying that you should never give up on a student, because you are like, you can be the person that changes their lives and not even know it. So by you saying, oh, well, they already have this, or maybe they don't have this, then you have like ruined their lives. You don't even know that power that you have. And so that just saying that you believe in them and giving them one more person, even if they have like the perfect family, giving them one more person that they can count on and that believes in them is amazing.
think what Alicia said, and as well as Kaiser, a lot of teachers, they do hold a lot of power in influencing their students, but a lot of it does come from parents, right? So I didn't have a family that was like super major on education, or not education, schooling, and they weren't always forcing me to like get on my grades, and all the pressure coming from schooling. But I got a lot of empowerment from my teachers. I did, just in class when I needed help, be like, hey, you need help? And I'm like, huh, yes, I do. But they would show it when I needed it the most. A lot of it came from myself when I realized there's a lot of power, in words and education and learning, and knowledge is power. And so when I really took a stand on that, I would research random things, just try to learn as much as I could. And so when I just realized that there's so much in education, and that's why I take a stand in learning as much as I can, and that's what empowers me. It definitely helps when teachers are also, they get personal and they do their best to help you in any way they can.
Yeah, so I, just like Caleb, found out that like education was the best way to change a lot of racial biases that I thought were very imminent, need to be changed in my primarily white and Asian school district. And I think the thing that really set me off to pursue changing these things was the death of George Floyd. Um, the death of George Floyd, or rather the murder of George Floyd, was something that was just so raw and emotional. And as a person of color, but not a Black American, I wanted to do the best that I could in order to support Black Americans in my school district, because they're at a very, very small minority. And I knew that in order to really promote racial equity, I needed to be an ally. And so that's why I got into this work. And I would say that a lot of the drive to be empowered in this work and to work towards change came from the murder of George Floyd and my subsequent really drive and push to try to make things better for all races, all students of all races in my school district. But I would say that I'm very privileged both by my race and by my socioeconomic status. And so I wasn't really able to really draw from my own trauma and experience. And so I really relied on reading about different incidents like police killing more people and really trying to drive that empathy and reaction out of myself to really inspire me to continue to work in this field. I would also say that in terms of teachers empowering me, I actually don't talk to my parents about this at all. They don't know what I'm in right now. They just know that they should probably leave me alone for around an hour because I'm on a call. So they don't know any of the work that I do. They just know that I'm really involved in racial equity. That's pretty much the crux of their knowledge. But I would say that that isn't bad. I don't necessarily need them to be involved in that because I've really found comfort in teachers from my school district. So even though I got involved individually at first, I had teachers reach out to me. I'm just gonna call them out by name, even though they're not on this call. Daryl Sushigi, Terry Dress, and Tracy Castro Gill. They were 3 people that were really instrumental in getting me into this work. And I think that teachers none of them ever taught me, none of them ever taught at schools that I went to, but they were from my school district. 2 of them are from my school district. One of them is a teacher in Washington. And I think that their help really helped me sustain my work, because without them, I don't think I would have the motivation to keep going forward.
This might be about we're focusing on the teachers, the empowerment by teachers, and this might be personal bias of mine. So at my old school I went to, it was one of these weird liberal arts school, and it was down south in Texas. And so these teachers, for about the first year it was all right, but the 3.5, 4 other years I was there, the teachers are bullies at that school. They were awful people. Some of those teachers were the worst people you will ever find in a teaching role. They were horrible people. There were kids that would get we had a string of abusive gym teachers that would like hit people. And then we had like a Latin teacher who gave kids like permanent stomach issues from like humiliating and screaming at them in class. There was a bunch of bigots at that school, like a bunch. It was like an issue. And so like that I spent all that time at that school just constantly put down for my personal beliefs. And it wasn't officially a Christian school, but everyone there was there was a lot of Southern Baptists at that school and a lot of other Christian groups there that weren't big on any other form of faith. And so for students like me who are atheist, or for our Muslim students or Jewish students, it was an issue. And we spent all this time being put down by our teachers. And so just to explain a little bit why I'm not as much and big as the empowerment by the teacher thing is, I spent so much time being just put down by teachers who were telling me like, oh no, you're not cut out, like you're not supposed to be here, like you're a fluke. And so like, and they'd say some awful things that I'm not going to say on the call, because it's like they're just not nice things to say to a fifth grader, a sixth grader, or a seventh grader. There's not things you should say to them. And so like, to me, and I do think empowerment by the teacher is important in the right setting, but I do think that often those relationships mean a lot more to the student than they mean to the teacher. And so I think it's so important not to put such a huge like focus on that, because like at the end of the day, the teacher sees you for, if you're in high school and secondary, you see that kid probably every day or every other day for about an hour. And so that could mean a lot to the student, but to the teacher who has 600 students, that doesn't mean as much. And so sometimes I see an issue with placing so much emphasis on that, because you want to find that connection to someone you should have access to all the time. And sometimes that is the person you have the most access to. But I often think you should make that someone who's a more permanent fixture in your life that doesn't have such a limited interaction with you. And to someone who that relationship is equal to or means more to them than it means to you, because it allows that relationship to truly like support you. Because if it's just this like half relationship to the teacher, and it could mean so much to the student, I've had this before where like it meant so much to me, but the teacher didn't really care. And so like it's like this like bridge you got to be careful with. And again, this is all my personal like thought and explaining my logic behind why I think it's like family support over teacher support. But and teacher support is important. I don't disagree with that. That's very important. But I do think like what drives you should really look for something that's more permanent. And like on the elementary level, I don't think that's as true, because you're with that teacher every day. And that's where you see like sometimes you might see the teacher more than you see your parents. But like especially when you get into the high school level, I think it's important to look for those permanent friendships that are more equal among your peers or your parents or relatives and things like that than with the teacher. And so that's just my personal thought on that though.
Yeah, I think there's always limitations to what we can do, but I think it's important to never negate the possibilities and how influential you can be, because some people don't have a stable family at home that they can look to for a permanent relationship, or they have social anxiety and they can't make friends at school, or it's hard for them to make friends and have those permanent things. So maybe having an hour where someone says they can believe in you is better than having nothing at all. And so I think to always approach relationships with a positive outlook and saying, what are the possibilities? What can I do? Not to be discouraged by like what you can't do or things that you can't fix at that point in time. And so I just want to say that. But also when Priyaka mentioned like the murder of George Floyd and kind of how that empowered her, it made me think of how those conversations surrounding race and equity or culture in general need to happen at school more often, because that's part of our lives. This whole time we've been talking about you need to do what's best for students and what we need. And that's what's prevalent in our lives is our race, our culture, and everything that's going on in the world. And so by avoiding those conversations, you're avoiding who your students are as people, or your whatever. And I heard a teacher once say, and I wrote this down, we were talking about like teacher trainings. They were like, yeah, I don't think our school's going to do like the equity trainings this year. They just don't work. We don't get people who show up. And I was like, wait, that's why we need them, because you guys don't have the training you need because you're not showing up because you don't care. And so I think to have those tough conversations, like in Kaiser's experience, that would not have worked. Saying, here, talk about Black Lives Matter, that's not going to work. The teachers need trainings, but just because right now the system of like training teachers to have tough conversations isn't working, doesn't mean we need to scrap it. It means we need to make it better. And so I just wanted to say that because it was completely shocking to me, that like approach of let's get rid of something that's not working instead of let's change it to make our teachers and our educators, administrators better fit to have these important conversations with their students.
And then I think the something we hear often in school is, oh, we can't talk about that here. And the question I always think is why? Like, school is a place for learning, right? So why should we not learn about everything? You need to. And then going back to the equity we were talking about, or the George Floyd incident after that, how many people took up and said, all right, this is wrong. How many continue to still say this is wrong? Or was it just back then it was wrong? But I think an issue is, especially when you hear messages or something from district leaders or officials saying, we want to work towards equity. They make a statement one time and think it's all good. But that's why you continue to put pressure on the schools, the districts, the leaders, and make sure that it's not just a one-time statement, it is a continual action.
Love it. You guys are definitely amazing, and I wish we could continue on and explore these topics even more. But before we move on to, we have a little less than 3 minutes. There was one last question that was in our Q&A, which was, well, how do you suggest education professionals and their how do they help their students broaden their scope of possibilities that are essentially available to their students? How do they help them with that? And if you guys just have a quick suggestion for that question, that would be amazing.
Something that we talked about in our youth ethnic studies group was making sure that the teachers are not impressing their views on the students, giving students the space to develop their own perspectives and their own ideas and opinions on what they're being taught is important.
Diversifying what's being taught.
Yeah, I completely agree with the last two statements from Caleb and Layla. So just teachers could really help students by not pushing their ideas of what success is onto a student, because they have to recognize that every student is different and every circumstance is different.
I would say approach teaching or approach students as a relationship as a two-way street, because if you learn about them, then you can use your knowledge and expertise and your resources to help who they are and who they want to be, not who you think they should be.
I think I agree pretty much word for word with what Priyanka said. And Ali said, I saw Ali nodding. I disagree with that too, but I think it's we're widening the horizon of what success is. That's the key, is that it's drilled into you what success is. And success looks like a lot of different things for a lot of different people. If one guy wants to chill, if his life goal is to own 30 PlayStations and win the lottery and live on nacho cheese dip for the rest of his life, he should be able to do that. That's his bar of success. Right? Like, and that's a silly example. That's a very, very silly example. But if that's what your bar of success is, that's your bar of success. And so, like, I think when you drill this idea and sometimes unattainable goals, like, not everyone's going to go to an Ivy League college, and that's drilled into kids. It's on all the TV shows. It's on all the classroom walls with all like the Cornells and the Harvard flags up on the wall. Like, you can't, sometimes that's not attainable. Like, and so, like, just change the definition of success. Like, we don't want this unattainable bar. It needs to be reachable, and it needs to be to each individual student.
Absolutely. We want to thank you so much for being here. We look forward to hearing from you in the future. As your voices are, this was just one little snippet. And so please, thank you so much for coming. And thank you, participants, for listening. And you guys have a wonderful day.